So hello everyone joining us. We're going to start the webinar in about 1 or 2 minutes. And for those people who just arrived, we're going to start the webinar in a minute or two.
It's real cold outside. I take it to the football games. Because my legs should be cold. I be sitting there on wrap up.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are waiting for one more panelist to join us, but she should be with us momentarily. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kevin Wellner of the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I'm also the director of the National Education Policy Center, which is one of the sponsors of today's webinar. The other sponsors are the University of Illinois, the History of Education Society, the American Educational Research Association, the University of Virginia's Center for Race and Public Education in the South, and the Journey for Justice Alliance. We hope to leave considerable time during the second half of the webinar for participant Q&A, so please submit your questions using the Q&A function that you'll find if you bring your mouse to the bottom of the screen, not the chat function that you normally use for Zoom meetings. A couple other housekeeping items. We'll be recording the webinar. In fact, I should probably have pressed that button already. So let me see here. Okay. And so we're probably going to post the recording on the website of the University of Virginia Center for Race and Public Education in the South, one of our sponsors. If you'd like to discuss the webinar through social media, we'll use the hashtag #RightToLiteracy. And let's get going. I'll start off by introducing our moderator for today, Erin Einhorn, who's a Detroit-based national reporter for NBC News Digital. She covers education and other issues for NBCnews.com. And she's been covering the Gary B case since it was first filed in 2016, originally as the founding bureau chief for Chalkbeat Detroit, where she focused on covering issues of education equity in Detroit schools. And she's also a public school parent in Detroit. So Erin, let me turn this over to you.
Hi, thanks so much. And thanks everybody who's listening and everybody who's participating. I think this is a really important conversation, and I hope we all get a lot out of having this conversation and thinking about what this means and going forward. And we have a bunch of terrific panelists who, let me just quickly introduce everyone, and then we'll circle back through and everyone can give some opening statements. So we have Kimberly Jenkins Robinson, just wave. She's a national expert who speaks domestically and internationally about educational equity, equal educational opportunity, civil rights, and the federal role of education. She's the author of 2 books on the federal right to education, including A Federal Right to Education, Fundamental Questions for Our Democracy with NYU Press in 2019, and The Enduring Legacy of Rodriguez, Creating New Pathways for Equal Educational Opportunity. We have Christine Bowman, who I think we can't see. at least I can't see her. I don't know. She couldn't call in, but hopefully we'll work out those technical difficulties. But she's here, I swear. She's a professor of law at Michigan State University and associate dean for academic and student affairs in the College of Education. She's a leading education law scholar with expertise in free speech, racial, ethnic equity, and governance in the K-12 context, and has published widely in prominent law journals, law reviews, journals for multidisciplinary audiences and edited volumes. And we have G2 Brown. Can you give us a wave, G2? He's the national director for the Journey for Justice Alliance, a network of 30 grassroots community-based organizations in 23 cities, organizing for a community-driven school improvement. And he was formerly the education organizer for the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. G2 has organized in the Kenwood Oakland neighborhood for over 17 years, bringing community voices to the table on school issues. And Derek Black is the professor of law at the, Derek's waving, there you go. Professor of law at University of South Carolina School of Law. His areas of expertise include education law and policy, constitutional law, civil rights, evidence, and torts. Current focus of his scholarship is the intersection of constitutional law and public education, particularly as it pertains to educational equality and fairness for disadvantaged students. And he is the author of Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. And folks, if I left off any of your publications or any other key details in your bios, please chime in with those as we come around for the opening statements. And with that, let's start with G2. Take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. And it's an honor to be a part of this conversation. I agree, it's very important. In a moment where we see an openness to kind of what Black people have felt all along, this sense of sabotage, like our quality of life is sabotage, and there's an awareness to this. I think it's really important that we don't water down what we're seeing, and also what our people have experienced during our experience here in America. Yeah, my name is G2 Brown. That's an old bio, so I guess I'll provide a couple of updates. I am from Chicago, Illinois, and I've been a community organizer most of my adult life. I think that it's important to make a distinction between folks that are activists and folks that are community organizers. They are different. And I think activists are individuals who raise their voices around the issue that they care about. And the work of organizers are to work with the people directly impacted by an issue so that they can build strategies so that they can win power to address issues they care about. So in other words, an activist lifts their voice, an organizer works to lift the voices of others. To give you a historical context, I think that Jesse Jackson may be one of the more celebrated activists that we've experienced in the 20th century, but Ella Baker was one of the greatest community organizers in the 20th century. So I chose to do that work because that was not my career goal. I thought I was gonna play defensive end for the Chicago Bears, and that didn't quite work out. So it was actually an experience engaging with some young people at an elementary school that inspired me to become a volunteer at this community-based organization. And that began, my path, and I've been in it since I've been 24 years old. So Journey for Justice Alliance is a network, I won't even say it's an alliance of grassroots community-based organizations. We're now in 36 cities. We have membership organizations in Puerto Rico and in Johannesburg, and we're committed to equity in public education. We understand that the biggest issue in public education is not failing schools. It is not disinterested young people or uninvolved parents. The issue in public education is that America has never wanted to educate Black people, and that despite the legislation or litigation that we have passed, there's always been an organized resistance to making education equitable. We just released a report, folks can see it on our website in 2018, called Failing Brown v. Board, where we did something very simple. We just compared the curriculum offerings between Black schools across the United States between schools that serve predominantly white children and schools that serve predominantly Black and brown children. And just when you look at the course offerings, it's obscene, what we call the access to inspiration that children that happen to be white have that are denied children in our communities. Everything from lack of access to, well, let me start here. We view education as inspiration and information that prepares a people to make their way in the world, prepares a people to transform the world. And so what's most important for an educator is to be able to help that young people find that moment of self-discovery, because that moment of self-discovery raises possibilities. So that means that, as they say in Finland, the school must be prepared to meet the needs of the child, as opposed to the child being forced to meet the needs of the school. And so in our communities, what has historically happened is that we have had to fight, claw, and scratch for just a piece of equity, and often have suffered through state-sponsored sabotage when we've made those gains. In my personal journey, I served on the local school council at a school in Chicago called Walter Dyer. It was the last, I lived and worked in a community called Bronzeville, which is a historic Black community on the south side of Chicago, was once considered the Black metropolis in the United States, had the highest concentration of Black doctors and lawyers in the United States. Dr. Daniel Hill Williams, first man to perform successful surgery on the human heart, built Providence Hospital in Bronzeville, which was the first teaching hospital for Black doctors and nurses in the United States. This prominent community has suffered from municipal and private disinvestment to where it devolved from a center of Black excellence to a ghetto. So I served on the local school council at Walter Dyer for 10 years. It was our last open enrollment high school in the Bronzeville area. I would also like to say that Bronzeville is 10 minutes from downtown Chicago, right off the lakefront. So in the early 2000s, we were first hit with the notion of school closings and the rhetoric around that was created around, we have to do something for these children. The schools are failing. And they began to attack the schools in our community, never addressing the fact that many of our schools had, in some cases, I'm thinking of a school called Albert Einstein, where there were 3 computers on the 2nd floor, where our young people didn't have a teacher aide, where our young people had libraries with no librarian, while young people had no access to world language, so they can understand that actually in the world, they're not a minority, that most of the people that live in Brazil look like them. They could never have those types of experiences to be inspired to realize that they can do more. But they went to schools that said, if your test scores were not at this level, your school was actually deemed as failing. We put you on academic probation, and then we'll close you. Despite the fact that W.B. Du Bois knew in 1940 that standardized testing was around the illusion of white supremacy. It had nothing to do with how to gauge students, what students' capabilities were. So I sat on this local school council, and Rahm Emanuel, who was the mayor at that time, made a proposal to close this school, phase it out, despite the fact that in 2008, we had the largest increase of students going to college in the entire district. For 2 straight years, we had the largest decrease in arrests and suspensions. And in 2011, we won the ESPN Rise Up Award as a small school that was doing great things but needed help. We got a $4 million renovation to our gymnasium, and the next year they voted to phase us out. But what I had been doing as an organizer had been meeting with parents and community around our own vision. We realized that in the absence of a vision by the district, it was important for us to develop our own vision. So we built a vision and a plan for Walter Dyer, which resulted in what we call a sustainable community school village. It was Dyer and 6 of his feeder schools. So what was interesting and what I learned through that process was that if the intention of the municipality is to push you out of the community, they will not support infrastructure for working and low-income Black families. And so what ended up happening is, despite the fact we developed an excellent proposal, it was deemed superior to the other proposals that were submitted for like charter schools and things of that nature. Mayor Rahm Emanuel reneged, and on August 17th, 2015, I and 11 other parents, in order to win a world-class high school for low-income Black children, had to go on a hunger strike. We had done everything else. We had negotiated with the district. We had presented proposals. We had gone to sham school board meetings. We had begged, we had pleaded. We did everything that an involved public is supposed to do. We held 6 town hall meetings. We got 5,000 petition signatures. We did all the types of things to show the community wanted this plan, but the issue was the site of Dyett High School is where they wanted to build the Obama Presidential Center. And so they wanted us out of the neighborhood. And so we had to go on a hunger strike. And in order to beat Rahm Emanuel, we had to make national news, and we had to pressure him that way. And today the school is open with $16 million in new investments. Irene Robinson, who went on the hunger strike, was hospitalized twice. So there's an old proverb that says the truth is simple, if it's complicated, it's a lie. And Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, also said that anyone who demands your silence, no one is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow. So what has happened historically in this country is that our silence has been demanded, despite lynchings that have never stopped, despite the sabotage of our food production and delivery systems, our housing, our education, things that most Americans take for granted, right? I'll close, but I was in a room with white organizers, brothers and sisters in Buffalo, New York. And I just asked them, I said, you know, because they were asking me, why do you always talk about race? And the room was maybe 60% white, 40% black. And I asked them, I said, how many of you all had a decent school in your neighborhood? Most of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you all had a grocery store? The liquor store on the corner of your block was not the grocery store. Most of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you all never experienced a slumlord, right? You never had rats and roaches in your apartment, or lack of heat, or lack of air conditioning, but a person demanding your rent? Most of them raised their hand. I said, how many of you all had a hospital where you didn't have to go to a third-rate medical clinic? Most of them raised their hand. I asked them a simple question. How many sit-ins did you have to do to get it? And the point that we're making with all of that is that racism is both overt and covert. When we watch a police officer just callously take the life of George Floyd, that's a shock to the system. But it's also a shock to the system when you can't have housing. It's also a shock to the system when the Black businesses in your community are defunded and closed and replaced by people who care less about your voice than the folks that were there before. It's also racism when your children can't learn about their history and culture, or they don't have access to world language, or they got overcrowded classrooms, or their schools are over-policed, right? They're in kindergarten getting suspended or being walked out in handcuffs, right? And so what I would like to offer to this is that racism is like an infection that has infected every quality of life area that we think about. Standards of beauty, again, food production and delivery systems, education, housing, safety, how we deal with police. Everywhere you look, this country has been infected by racism, and the infection is deepened because of our lack of will to confront it, our lack of will to honestly confront it. And often and I think the limits of America's willingness to address these issues has been white people's, the levels of white patience. And if white people feel insulted, if it's about a shift in power, then our eyes are closed. What happened to Eric Garner was just as sick as what happened to George Floyd. I remember as a young man, I remember a brother named Malice Green in Detroit, Michigan, who was beat so hard by the police that they knocked off part of his scalp. And I was invited to go see his shrine as a young man. That violence is centuries old, and there's never been any accountability for it. And since there's never been any accountability, there really hasn't been any transformation from the dominant society. So hopefully this moment, where we have a multiracial sense of I'm fed up, I think those of us that are adults, our job is not to get in the way. Those young people are right. They're right to be outraged. They're right not to demand reform. This does not need to be tweaked. It needs to be transformed. And they will lead us in that direction. Our role as elders and adults is to give sage advice. And if we don't have the same fire that they do, we need to just step aside, because they didn't create these conditions, they inherited them. And I'll stop there.
Gosh, well, that was, thank you so much for that. Really, I mean, especially at this really important moment that we're having this conversation. And I've been struck over the last few weeks as we're all talking about police and ways we reform the police, that how much of these conversations really need to be applying to the school and to schools and all kinds of other things in our lives. And I really appreciate that view from the streets and the role of activism and the role in different ways that we can create change. And I think it's really interesting now also at this moment that, you know, to explore ways that the courts can be a way of facilitating change. And so I think we're all interested in hearing more about what role this court case can have in future fights like the one you all fought there in Chicago. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christine, who's going to give us a basic background on the Gary B case and you know what and how it's moved through the courts and where it stands now. Take it away, Christine.
Thank you, and I am honored to be here today with this group of talented, thoughtful, wonderful panelists. I also hope that my internet connection holds up, so if it doesn't, I trust that folks will mute me and go forward with the panel as we need to have a great experience for our attendees. So as G2, as I was listening to your comments and thinking about them, you know, I think they situate our panel so well in many ways because as we're thinking about social change, there are so many ways to achieve that, right? And especially right now, I think for all of us thinking about the many different ways in which we need to be pursuing change at the same time and the many different avenues is really important. And so when we're thinking about change, we're responding to something. And this case in particular, the Gary B case, was coming out of Michigan and responding to a situation where Michigan has underfunded public schools, and that has had some really severe consequences, creating incredible inequalities between districts. And the worst manifestations of these, some of the most severe manifestations, are schools with single-digit literacy rates, like the ones in Detroit that were the focus of this case, both traditional charters and public schools. So from 2013 to 2015, plaintiffs brought a similar case to the one we're talking about today. They started in state court, and they said, we have a right to read under the state constitution. And this case was focused on the Highland Park district, which, like the Detroit district, is a primarily Black district and also has very low literacy rates of the students. Now, in the state court, the plaintiffs won at the trial court, but lost on appeal, and the state Supreme Court declined to hear the case. And this was actually one step in a very long history of Michigan courts that just are not interested in education rights cases, not interested in education funding cases. And so that meant the only real option left, because the state legislature wasn't responding, the state executive branch hadn't been able to do anything meaningful, or at least meaningful enough in this way, and the state courts were out, it meant they needed to think about other options. So they turned to federal courts. And here they brought a variety of claims focusing on the right to literacy, and two big claims. One was that there's a federal constitutional right to literacy, and the second was that the state is a proper defendant. And both of these were very difficult claims to make. Really creative lawyering, very innovative, thoughtful lawyering, and really an uphill battle. Now, at the district court level, the trial court said, you know, if there ever were a case for a right to literacy, this would be it. It would be under these facts, and the state would be a proper defendant. Because remember, in Detroit, the state took over the school district for quite some time via state-appointed emergency managers and many other activities. But the district court said there is no such fundamental right to education. And so after that, it quickly went up on appeal.
All right. And Kimberly, why don't you tell us what happened there? Oh, you're muted.
I am muted. Okay, now you can hear me. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of the case because I know we want to make sure the audience has time to ask questions. So I'm just going to give a broad overview. So what happened on appeal is that the Sixth Circuit ruled, it's a 3-judge panel, ruled that there is a right to a basic minimum education. And it found that right in the substantive due process clause. So what does that mean? It found that there were 2 reasons, justifications supporting a basic minimum right to education. So first, that it's deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. And second, that it's implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. And so essentially, what that boils down to is that education is both an important and central part of our nation's development and history. The development of compulsory schooling requiring education in state constitutions that the state provide education, stemming back from, developing that through both through Reconstruction, as Derek talks about extensively in his scholarship, but also up even as we admitted new states, requiring them to protect education and provide education, as well as the fact that education is central to the linchpin of our government. When you have a democracy, you have to have educated citizenry for democracy to work. Otherwise, you merely end up with a handful of elites determining what the political agenda is. And in some ways, unfortunately, we have that in the United States. We have those with the most money and political power wield outside influence. And so, but what the court recognized in Gary B. is that, education is the key to political power. And that is important for everyone. Everyone should have that education so that they can wield the power that each citizen gets in a democracy to make an informed and intelligent vote. And then I just want to note 2 arguments the court rejected, and then I'll stop there, which is first, the court said, look, many people are saying, judicial restraint requires that the political process decide this. The problem with that argument, the court said, is the literacy that you're denying these students prevents them and their families from exercising, the political process to achieve the literacy they want. And so you can't say go to the political process when you don't have the tools to engage the political process effectively. So the court said that's not a restraint here. And then second, the court rejected this false dichotomy between negative and positive rights. And without going down a whole huge body of scholarship about that, the short answer is the court said, look, we have recognized affirmative rights before. Look at, for example, the right to marry. But second, they said education is different. And this education is different because education is provided by the state. And so it's different from food. It's different from housing. There's no total state takeover of housing, right? But for education, there is, the overwhelming majority of children in the United States attend a public school, state funded. And so because of that takeover, education is different. And so the court held that there was a basic minimum right to education, and so returned it to the trial court to have a trial on whether that was being denied. So ultimately, though, before they went to trial, they determined to settle the case. And so the case was ultimately settled in a way that allows for additional funding to be provided to the children in Detroit to obtain literacy. And the governor agreed to support legislation, propose and support legislation to provide additional funding to for literacy programs within the district, as well as things such as reducing class size, improving facilities. So there's a kind of comprehensive list that the settlement agrees that she will propose funding for. She also, though, notes she can't guarantee the legislature will enact that, but she does commit to proposing that, as well as an additional payment that will be made on behalf of the plaintiffs. So that is a really short summary of a fairly long opinion.
Thanks. It's also worth noting that Governor Whitmer is a Democrat and has been pushing for these funding, but she has a GOP-controlled legislature. So, and they are facing a pretty severe fiscal crisis, as are most states, because of the pandemic. So we'll see how all of that plays out in the next budget cycle. All right. So let's talk about kind of national context and what this means. And Derek, why don't you take that?
Yeah, first of all, just thanks to John Hale, who's this is his brainchild, and thanks to Kevin Wellner for bringing it together and for everyone participating. Gary B is like a better roller coaster ride than you could find at any amusement park in America. I mean, it somehow or another managed to be inspiring, disappointing, shocking, and relieving all in the couple of weeks span. But for all the drama in Gary B, there's an enormous amount of other equally, if not more important activity in other cases. We've got state constitutional cases moving forward. Obviously, that wasn't an option in Michigan, but in Pennsylvania, which has some of the deepest funding inequality in the nation and serves an enormous number of students, their state courts had said no for decades, and now they are allowing that to move forward. So we've got important stuff happening in Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Minnesota, various other states, and that's all new. But even in the federal courts themselves, there's two other related cases, one in Mississippi and one in Rhode Island, that are progressing, although they've not gotten nearly the fanfare of Gary B. And Mississippi is the one that I think ought to teach us the most. Mississippi plaintiffs aren't claiming that there's this federal fundamental right to education. They're really just going back to basic history and saying, look, when Mississippi was readmitted to the Union following the Civil War, there were conditions on their reentry into the Union, and one of those explicitly, by law, by Congress, was that Mississippi could never go backwards on the education that it had just placed in its state constitution. And of course, Mississippi went backwards in Jim Crow. Mississippi went backwards after Brown versus Board of Education. And so plaintiffs are saying, look, this was the deal Mississippi struck to re-enter this union, and they're not making good on it. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, about a month, just actually 2 weeks, I think it was, before Gary B was decided, the Fifth Circuit hasn't validated all of their claims, but they said plaintiffs can proceed on this. They have at least stated a facial claim. There's also another case in Rhode Island that's much more similar to Gary B, except for their claim is more about, rather than just being about literacy, it's about the broad array of skills that citizens need to be prepared to participate in society. But to me, there's a bigger thing going on in all of these cases, particularly the federal cases, and it is that there's a much firmer grounding for education in the nation's history than we've ever appreciated. This claim of a federal right or fundamental right to education isn't something that was cooked up or ought to just be recognized in 2020, but that actually it's been here with us all along, that it was part of the plan for growth and expansion of the nation in 1785 in the Northwest Ordinances before states like Ohio even existed, and that following the Civil War, it became part of what it means to have a Republican form of government or a democratic form of government, that ultimately, if you aren't going to provide education to your citizens, you're not operating democracy in America. And then the other thing, which I'll just go on a little bit to the side because G2 as always inspires me. I mean, that history is just unbelievable. As I tell folks, within 6 months of the opening of the Civil War, African Americans were fleeing the plantation to get behind enemy lines. Well, Union lines, friendly lines for them, to get behind Union lines, and began seeking education immediately upon getting there, right? At Fort Monroe in Virginia, the only place that the North held, African Americans began learning to read or building on the reading that they'd already been doing in secret, right there, right, in 1862, 1863, not after the Civil War was over. And we should also say there's pictures, if you bother to go and look, of missionary teachers under an old oak tree with numerous African-American students gathered around them learning to read, right, in 1863. That oak tree now is at the center of campus at Hampton University. We don't know our history well enough in these respects, and I'll just boil it down to an oversimplified history, which is the idea of public education for all. And the idea that education had to be a right that all citizens could access is really the gift that the freedmen gave America. They were the ones who forced and organized and pushed a statewide system of education. In fact, in Arkansas, and the last one I'll tell you, African Americans were so committed in the aftermath of the Civil War to education, and there was not sufficient federal funds to run those schools, that they, just removed from slavery, right, gathered the money to keep those schools running for the rest of the school year, right? And so that ultimately, obviously, Jim Crow tries to hide that history and has squashed that history, but we were on a very good trajectory in 1868. And I think bringing that story about how where these state education systems came from, where the right to education came from, is also part of our education reckoning. It's part of our racial reckoning. And I think that a greater appreciation of that is important for the courts. And I think Judge Clay's opinion did some of that. He didn't go as deep as I would have wanted him to in the Sixth Circuit. But it's also an important part of what's going on in the state. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Erin.
Yeah, I think, thanks everyone. This was, I think, really, really helpful and brought us up to speed. I'm hoping one of you can talk a little bit about this idea of a constitutional right to education. I think before I started writing about this case, I think maybe I might have assumed that we had a right to education, because I mean, I knew, we have a right, to free, appropriate education. So what does it mean to have a constitutional right to education? And what does it mean that we haven't had it until now, or do we even have it now? I'm hoping somebody can break this all down for us in really broad terms about how long have people been pushing to have the constitutional right to education declared, and why, and what is the significance, for those students who Jitu is advocating for in Chicago, and for the students going to school all around me here in Detroit. What does this mean? I don't know, Kimberly, you want to take that, or?
Yeah, no, I'll jump in on that one. So, you're not alone, Erin. Many Americans think that they do have a constitutional right to education. And so the reason why I undertook the first edited volume I did about San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez is because it's just a case that isn't talked about very much. The court there held in a 5-4 decision that the federal constitution does not recognize a right to education. But in that case, that case was focused on funding equity, so disparities between districts. And it left open the door that the Gary B case walked through, which was, is there a right to an adequate education? So it sort of rejected this equity suit, but said, no case has been made that that students are denied the basic right to education such that they can't exercise their rights to vote in free speech. And so here, there's definitely an effort to address that gap, which is a gap in adequacy. But I would say that this case, having been decided, that, so some of the details I didn't get into, to keep it brief, was that the decision was ultimately vacated because it was agreed to be reheard by the Sixth Circuit. Now that is not going to go forward. However, the case itself doesn't mean that children across the United States have a federal right to education. The hope is that at some future point, we would have a court that's amenable to that. I do know that the litigation in Rhode Island, that they're hoping that they can get to a court that's, a Supreme Court ruling. And there's some discussion that maybe a conservative court would recognize that. I'm not as convinced of that. However, what's significant about this case, even with its current legal status, is that it does provide a roadmap if a future court wants to hold that there is a right to education. It would not be unprecedented. It gives a roadmap for other circuits to follow, such that maybe at a future point, we might actually recognize a federal right to education. But for now, children still in the United States do not have a constitutional right to education.
Erin, I wanted to jump in there. You also asked the why don't we? I guess what I would say is that if you look at the original creation of the nation, we were changing to a different democracy. We were new in the world in the idea that elites were going to hand over power to regular folks. Now that, by regular folks, they didn't mean women or African Americans. They were regular white males. But in any event, those folks hadn't been voting before. And so you look at Jefferson and Adams and all those thinkers, the idea was, look, if we're going to give even poor white folks the right to vote, they need to be educated, right? Because otherwise they'll get bamboozled one way or another and cheated out of democracy. That didn't work out so well. You know, we can skip forward to Reconstruction. And I think what Reconstruction showed us is that the whole idea of America was false, right? In thinking that we could just make education a good idea and hope that it happens and only give it to some people and not others. And so the central idea there, primarily of the freedmen, but also poor whites who hadn't been getting education in the South, was that citizenship demands it, and therefore we will require it to be in all of our state constitutions. Well, then we had Jim Crow and we moved backwards again, right? But if you look at all the NAACP's briefings, all of the argumentation there was, and the reason why they started with education was they said, look, the education is the central pillar of finally fully opening citizenship to African Americans that was denied in Jim Crow. What do we do even broader than that? What I would say is, to this why question, is that if you look at the expansion and contraction of education from the beginning of the nation until the end, it has always been a question about how open is our democracy going to be. The more, at those moments in time when we want to expand democracy, want to expand access to the ballot, those are the same moments in time when we have tried to expand access to education. But at that same time, those moments during Jim Crow were about contracting citizenship, contracting voting, and therefore education was contracting. And I would put to you that today, as we see attempts to limit access to the ballot box, as we see people being upset about these state constitutional cases that demand more in terms of resources from the state, we see organizations, I won't name them, some of them are political parties, some of them are lobbyists for political parties. We see those people saying, you know what, we don't even want public education anymore. What we want are private schools and vouchers or privately run charters. That is not disconnected from this question of our broader expansion or narrowing of democracy.
Yeah, just a quick reminder to folks listening. If you have questions for the panelists, I see some of you are already sending in your questions, but please send in the questions and we'll get to those in just a second. I have one last question, and that is a little bit political and a little bit recent historical, which is the sort of reminder that this case, the Gary B case, was filed in the fall of 2016. And if you all remember what was going on in the fall of 2016, it was an election year, and most polls showed that Hillary Clinton was going to be our next president and that she would get 1 or 2 Supreme Court nominees, which maybe that might have seemed like a good time to bring a case that could potentially have gotten to the Supreme Court and been about, on the question of constitutional right to education. That isn't what happened. We got a different president, and that president has had 2 Supreme Court nominees, and who knows, might get another one or 2. So, now we have the Rhode Island case is working its way through the courts. If the First Circuit goes a different direction than the Sixth Circuit, that's increases the likelihood that the Supreme Court will take this case up. And there's other ways that this could get to the Supreme Court. So I don't know if anybody wants to read the tea leaves, but from the perspective of folks, the advocates, who've been pushing for that, what are the prospects of a case like this before the other circuit courts, before before the Supreme Court? I don't know who, Christine, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'll give it a start. So it's really difficult to think about that, honestly. And frankly, from the perspective of folks who are advocating for a right to education, it's not very optimistic. Thinking about the changes on the court and the direction that the court is moving in, I think there's a lot of hesitation, and that makes it difficult to try and think about how to plan for litigation that creates social change, because litigation can do a lot of different things. It can change the discussion that we have in the public square. It can help inform how we think about questions. It can help us decide that something really is important enough that we need to deal with it through the legislature or another way. And if we're thinking about those outcomes of litigation, I think there is more hope. But if we're thinking about a Supreme Court that seems unlikely to uphold an affirmative right to education in any way, then it's really a challenge to think about how advocates use the courts if ultimately they know that they want to get to a certain point and try and stop there. And that's part of what ended up happening in this case, is that the case stopped at the Sixth Circuit. And I think that was very intentional on the part of the plaintiffs. And I'll finish this up by answering a question I've seen pop up in the chat about the Sixth Circuit. And the question is about what does it mean to vacate this? And, oh, sorry, I lost the other question. The question was basically, what does it mean to vacate this? And then what do we think will happen in the Sixth Circuit going forward? And I just want to clarify that vacating means that essentially, yes, the words are out there, but they don't have any effect. They don't have any binding effect going forward. And also the Sixth Circuit has said, you know, this case is done. We're not going to issue our own opinion as all of the, I think 14 judges of the Sixth Circuit. We're not going to issue an en banc opinion. We're just going to vacate the panel opinion of the 3 judges and close the door on the case.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to think about is that there's not only a judicial route to a federal right to education, there's also a legislative route. And so even if we don't think that the United States Supreme Court would recognize a federal right to education, Congress could still pass legislation that recognizes one, using the vast power that it exercises under the Spending Clause, also under the 14th Amendment. So it's important to recognize that there's more than one way to get there, because many feel like, say, you know, even have asked me sort of, what do you think about or write about these issues, given that the court is so conservative right now? It's like, you do want to think about not only the things that Christine mentioned, which is there are multiple reasons to bring litigation. It's not just about the outcome of that case. If you have a national conversation about it that shows the kind of conditions you have in Detroit, and then the court says, no, these children don't have any constitutional rights. Well, that actually might galvanize Congress to act just in the way that the current movement is seeking to get, you know, legislation in Congress about police reform. So I think we have to recognize the broader gains that could happen if the court looks at these terrible conditions and says nothing is, you know, constitutionally wrong here. You could really generate a national conversation, a push for national legislation to say, no, this should not be. And that is another possible outcome.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good segue to one of the questions that came from the audience. I don't know if we call it an audience in a webinar. We got a question, actually, Dana Kermanian, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, sent in a question for G2. And her question is, I'll just read it. It says, how do we confront racism perpetrated by people in education who think because they are Democrats, they are not part of the problem? Your example of Rahm Emanuel's actions against your school was striking. But if I might kind of broaden that a little bit, kind of beyond Chicago and beyond, you know, Rahm Emanuel and beyond that specific situation, and kind of shift it back a little bit to what Kimberly was talking about as far as the political opportunity. You know, whether or not we have a path to a constitutional right to education through the courts, is there a path through politics, you know, through Congress, through the state legislatures? You know, what can community advocates around the country be doing, folks who want to see that? I mean, what do you see as their prospects in that regard?
No, I appreciate the question. And we have a philosophy. We say freedom by litigation, legislation, or agitation. And one of the things that we tend to do, and I've had to confront my own comfort when I was talking to an elder, and I said, well, you know, when they reopen schools, and he looked at me and he said, what makes you think they're going to reopen schools? And I had to realize that, you know, I've been Americanized as well, right? And I struggle to be, you know, an organizer that is accountable and whose fire is always lit. But I had to confront my own comfort. And I don't think we've confronted our comfort, that our acceptance of the things the way they are. And I think the lesson we're learning now by seeing people of all races that are willing to confront power. In Seattle, they've driven the police out of a police station, and they've developed their own autonomous zone, right? I think what we're seeing is that there is a demand for a different belief system, right? A belief system that says zero tolerance for racism, not zero tolerance discipline policies that target our children, that has actually ruined the lives of millions of young people who only needed a counselor. The reason I come to school late is because I walk my little brother to school through a gang territory. My mother's on drugs. I'm being raised by my grandmother. This is what, but I'm coming every day. But the response was suspension. So instead of having zero tolerance targeting towards our young people, let's have zero tolerance for racism. And what has happened in the Democratic Party is the old line from the Kennedy days, we're working on it. We've got so much work to do. But my question would be, well, if it was his child, would he be satisfied with, we got so much work to do? No, if there was zero tolerance for racism, we should not be adhering to the likes and dislikes of those who do not see us as human. We should be setting a bar, and I think there's an opportunity to do that now. While people are agitated, there's an opportunity for learning. There's an opportunity for understanding. There's an opportunity for building a belief system that goes beyond someone's religious beliefs, but goes into kind of what kind of world do you want to see, right? How can we transform into a people-centered society? Just think about this. A police officer shot Laquan McDonald 16 times. Now, see, we say that, and because we're so used to it, it doesn't just blow our mind. It doesn't just stop this conversation and repulse all of us. But he shot a child 16 times. And the response from the other police, a mentally disturbed child who needed a crisis counselor, the response was not immediate shock by his officers tackling him, arresting him on the spot. The response from those officers was to cover it up. But then the response of the mayor of the city of Chicago, because he was not repulsed by it. He did not say my political career doesn't matter. He covered it up. That says there's a different belief system at play. Beliefs can be defined as, values can be defined as beliefs that govern your behavior. I think we must get past the point of rhetoric and sound bites. And get to the place of building a different belief system. Because what I'm feeling from when I'm out here on the street with these young people, what I'm feeling is the status quo is not going to work. Don't give us crumbs and tell us that it's cake. We want the whole damn cake. That's what they're saying. And they're not wrong. They're not wrong. Think about, my brother Derek is a historian. Think about the work that was done to create the Congressional Black Caucus. How legitimate that was, emerging from the civil rights movement, that men and women said, we're going to Congress to represent our people. These were the Shirley Chisholms of the world. They didn't want to eat from the trough of capitalism. They went into Congress with full intent of representing their people. Those interests have been replaced by what to me is rotted. So I'm not interested in somebody being in office just because they look like me, because you can do just as much harm whether you're black, blue, brown, or white. What matters to me is your belief system. When you talk to Miss Jones in Detroit, and Miss Jones is the mother of her block, but all she has is a high school diploma, but all the babies on the block respect her. Do you see wisdom in her? Or do you judge her because she doesn't have as many letters after her name as you? Do you realize the strength of a father that's living in a country that hates him, that he's raising 3 or 4 children and coaching football or coaching doing whatever he can? Do you respect that? Do you honor that man's humanity? So we'll never get to a movement for change until we confront our own complacency, to me. Well, until we confront our complacency, that we are complicit in this madness, then what we're doing is we're just, talking. And so I think what's important, Aaron, is that we understand that the same hatred that snatched George Floyd's life is the same hatred that Donald Trump had when he refused housing to Black and brown people. It's the same hatred that he did when he snatched the land from those people at Little Rock after they had finally convinced Barack Obama, well, it shouldn't have took that long, but they finally convinced him to stop the pipeline. This country that has taken everything from Native Americans, killed 100 million people. Yet, as soon as this man got in office, his first thing to do was to snatch their dignity from them. So to me, until we say zero tolerance for that, zero tolerance, then we are betraying our grandchildren, because we see who's in the White House right now. We see that they're hanging Black people from trees, calling it suicide, right? We took Michael Brown, on CNN, right? Not www.whitepower.com, but CNN. They had people there trying to say that there was a reason for this man to gun this little boy up like that. What they don't say is that one of his shots was to that young man's face. That type of savagery is acceptable because we've been so demonized. It's just like when people said that Africans were savages. This is why they're slaves, to cover up for that own savage behavior of wiping out civilizations, of taking women and raping women, of creating breeding camps, of wiping out entire villages, of chopping off somebody's tongue if they dared tried to speak Zulu, of lynching people and putting their body parts on the china cabinet. Frederick Douglass wrote a speech, said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" My son is working on a project right now, themed around that speech. And I would say that speech is relevant today. And this is not from someone who, I'm not some raving militant or anything like this. Is for someone who wants this to work. But I think what's helped me in my work when I've done my best is when I've allowed the truth not to scare me, but to energize me. And so I believe that legislation, litigation, and agitation is important, but it will not, and I think Christine mentioned it earlier, unless we are a conscious constituency, we will always settle for the crumbs instead of and we'll settle for reform instead of demanding transformation. And that's it.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was just really.
Piggyback on to what G2 had to say.
What's that?
Could I piggyback on to what he had to say?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to say, first of all, I confess to being naively optimistic, as I tell folks, even when the glass is damn near bone dry, sometimes I say it's half full. But so let's put that caveat out there to begin with. But I think the last 2 years, if what we're talking about is education, has given me a lot of hope. And it's because of the people that were in the streets, agitating in 25, or 20 or so states across the nation, calling, state capitals to account for what they haven't done and what they have done to public schools. And I think it's connected to G2's point. I mean, what I hear him saying is, he's exposing some truth, he's exposing some ideology. I think the one thing that education has been the beneficiary of and struggled with is this idea that it is this common ground for all of us. So we assume, right, that there are, or say some people with privilege can assume that, the motives are good. And following the last recession, teachers and families assumed, well, this pain that our schools are experiencing, that the state's trying to do the best they can. But after a decade, what we realized was, no, there were a bunch of folks who needed an excuse to go after public schools and public budgets. And they used a recession as that excuse because, the economy's booming, 5 years later, but the education budgets are still low. And in many states, still below where they were before. But what I find comforting or optimistic is that, really a mass movement, a multiracial mass movement of folks saying, wait a minute, the we're looking behind the screen now and realize that there's a lot of bad motives here, and we don't accept that. And those motives were Democratic motives, they were Republican motives, and everything in between. But what I think the organizing difficulty now is, how do you get bipartisan groups to come together? I mean, you look at the polling in the South, you know, I always cite to it, there's only a couple of percentage points that separate Democratic voters from Republican voters on questions of education, resources, and funding, but yet no one in the state house will act on that. And that's because I think there is ideology that isn't fully exposed for the rest of us to critique and attack. So, so anyway, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. So I know we're coming up on an hour, but I think we have time for another question. And I'm just kind of scrolling through some of the questions that folks have submitted. And there's quite a few about kind of impact of this decision and where this goes. And I'm just going to kind of combine a couple of them. Here's a question from Aaron Giannopoulos, who asks, if a right is ever recognized, how will that change inequities? Would successful claims allow courts to require the creation of new, more equitable education funding models, desegregation? How would some future recognition of a right make change? And then separately, Julie Sugarman sent in a question: if the courts declare there is a federal right to education, does that mean that the states could demand that the federal government fund it? So I'm hoping somebody could kind of take this idea of, you know, if we had a federal right to education, you know, how could students, how could schools, you know, specifically benefit from that?
Yeah, so if you look at the Gary B decision, I mean, one thing that the court says is that there is not only that there's a right to education, but what that means is that students are entitled to the facilities, teaching, and educational materials needed to attain that literacy. And so, or at least to have the opportunity to attain literacy. And so the idea is that you have this right that helps to guide what has to be provided. Now, I can tell you there's some divide over the opinion in the sense that you could easily have a very low level right if you tried to read this decision quite narrowly, because you might merely, you know, it's really about how rigorous a right this right to literacy is. And so there's wide room for interpretation in that. So what a right to education means will depend on how the courts are interpreting it or Congress defining it. So it's very possible it could be a very basic minimal right, even they use the adjective basic in the opinion, or it could be a robust, or what scholars call a thick right, that is, you know, much more impactful in schools. So it really just depends on how that right is interpreted, what case makes it forward, and what the court would say about it, or what Congress would say about it. In terms of the funding question, you know, the right, it would, although it would be a federal right and give you access to federal court to enforce it, that it would be up to Congress to choose to support funding to ensure that states provide it. So ultimately, the right is likely to be a federal right that states must provide. It would likely strongly push Congress to increase funding for education, because the states would clamor immediately and say, we can't do this on our own. And there's some truth to that in many states, not all of them, but many of them. And so I do think it would lead to an increase in funding, but to say that that would require the federal government to sort of open its purse string, you know, unleash a lot of funding is not necessarily the case.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? G2.
Yeah, and it just hit me, middle-aged moment. It was actually Kimberly who said that if you don't have an educated constituency, you can't have a politically active constituency. Did I get that right? You said that a little early? Okay. So I think that the opportunity to me is that the demand must come from the ground in concert with legislation and litigation is being passed. So, for example, one of the things that I'm saying this in all humility, I'm not, but this is something that it was a lesson for me after the fight for Diet High School, we began to spread sustainable community schools across the country. And actually got Elizabeth Warren to put it in her education platform, calling for 25,000 sustainable community schools. Now, and Bernie Sanders, we moved Bernie Sanders from 2016 on education, where he was just saying for-profit charters because he thought that would get him off the hook. He didn't support for-profit charters, to this election where he had in his Thurgood Marshall plan carrying most of the planks from my education platform. 10 years ago, I would have never believed that that was possible. So I think that organizing works, right? Every right that we have in this country, right? The reason, Aaron, that you're able to sit there as a major media figure and convene this conversation, the reason why we're able to be at colleges and universities, the reason why if I go to get on American Airlines and they can't stop me because of the color of my skin, is because somebody spoke power to power, right? Until America transforms, I believe we must develop a culture where people are prepared to make sure that their voices are heard. And I think that might sound very elementary, but I think to organize something like that, to organize that type of culture is actually a stroke of brilliance that we haven't experienced. You think about the Haitian Revolution. This sounds so crazy, but you think about the Haitian Revolution, when Toussaint Louverture and LeBlanc and other people were organizing. They created a warrior culture to beat the three strongest armies in the world, to beat the French, the Spanish, and the British. They developed a warrior culture. We cannot be an unconscious constituency and change this country. We can't, because there is an interest in undereducating our children, right? There's an industry in prisons. There's a list of American companies that use prison labor that as long as my arm, right? So there is interest, there is profit in our pain. So we can't be an unconscious constituency. So I believe that it's a combination of that, because then we produce certain types of people that become elected officials. We can't elect people because they inspire us, right? Because that's just having a good mouthpiece. But what are your values? Are they us or are they them, right? And there is a them. There is a them. And so to me, I believe that's the work right now, right? Like, how do we take advantage of this moment? And we begin to create institutions and structures that help people develop their own sense of identity, purpose, and direction. Because if we have our own sense of identity, who we are, then we understand why we are, not someone else determining your purpose for you, and then we know our direction. And so I believe that that's critical at this moment. And that will determine because we passed Brown v. Board of Education. We passed the Civil Rights Act, but we relaxed. We relaxed and we felt like we arrived, and for Black people, in my humble opinion, one of the mistakes that we made is we looked at integration as giving up what we had as opposed to having access to. And so many of those communities that were independent communities, we left those communities because we wanted to live somewhere else, as opposed to transforming those communities. And I believe that in this moment, we have to be much more, we have to learn from our past mistakes, and we have to be much more focused on how do we transform America. Cornel West was accurate when he called America a failed experiment, that this empire is a failed experiment, right? And I think when he said that on CNN, it was brilliant. So that's what I want to offer.
Oh, great, thank you. So I think we're coming up on the end of our time. What I'd like to do is give each of the panelists let's do this speed round style. So like 1 minute each, maybe even 30 seconds. If you feel like you could do it in like 140 characters, that would be terrific. But just like let's do like a quick speed round, go around. Any final comments, or if you wanna, take a quick shot at kind of what this could look like, if we had a federal right to education, what's something that is there a state that's doing it right? Is there somebody who's doing it? I'm pulling from one of the questions in this too, but just, what do you want to see come out of this, or, any other way you want to give us your final, final comments, and let's do it kind of in the direction where we did it on the way in. So really quickly, GT, you go first, and then we'll just go around really fast, 1 minute.
What if we shared a common belief that if you pay taxes, you have a right to a world-class pre-K through 12 system of education within safe walking distance of your home?
All right, Christine.
The Gary B case may not have been successful in its ultimate outcome, but the fact that we're having this conversation and that it has brought this issue to the forefront is a massive victory.
Yep, Kimberly.
So I think the key part of what we're fighting for here is fair and equitable funding and I agree with G2, for a world-class education. And that needs to be the focus at the federal level, at the state level, in Congress, in local school boards. That can go a long way to address the current opportunity and achievement gaps.
Derek.
Well, I'll go off script and just say that, every day it's a different story in terms of folks trying to bring our public education system down. And on one level, Gary B catches our attention, but the minutia of what Betsy DeVos has been trying to achieve, trying to take money from public schools and give them to private schools. This is actually coronavirus aid, and I and others have been working to try to stop that. It just boggles the mind. And if you didn't see today, what boggles the mind is that, the President of the United States saying that, private school vouchers are the biggest civil rights issue for the nation right now. That's not even the biggest civil rights issue for our schools. And I guess he doesn't realize that there are, criminal justice issues outside his door. So I would just say, stay vigilant on every education issue, because whether it's a fundamental right to education or just basic, coronavirus aid, there are folks on the other side trying to work just as hard as you are, except for their agenda is different.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank all the panelists, thank all the organizers. A lot of great institutions and people came together to pull together this important conversation. Just a quick reminder that if you missed parts of this, or if you want to share it with anybody else, the recording will be posted through the Center for Race and Public Education in the South at the University of Virginia. And I think that's it for now. So just let's, we'll keep watching this issue. We'll keep paying attention, and, maybe we'll see some change. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Erin.